Today we are launching once again another report. But for me, from my read, a very unique report that gets to the heart of something that we haven't seen before and we don't speak about is hidden homelessness within a traveller community. We all know that that the housing crisis that makes this report and other recent reports are so crucial. It's important to see the causes and the impacts of traveller homelessness and hidden homelessness in the region that this study investigated. And it's critical to have this come from the work of 6 traveller-led community development group voices, as Breda already said. Again, it's so important to have traveller voices at the centre of all research and studies. The powerful case study in this report also reminds us that we're talking about people, about traveller families, and the life effects by the homeless crisis and hidden homelessness. Travellers are 22% more likely than the general population to become homeless. At the same time, homeless figures do not include the high level of hidden homelessness, overcrowding, couch surfing, etc. People living in your backyards. You know, we as travellers know that overcrowded and halting sites is homelessness. We as travellers also know that having 2 families living in the one house, that the other family obviously hasn't got their own home, so they're homeless. And in this report, again, it highlights some of those facts. And that I've said in the launch of the Special Traveller Committee report was implementation is the key. You know, that if we're not going to implement these reports, if we're not going to implement the recommendations, well then, you know, we're not going to be part of any better future for traveller community. And what I said back in the launch of the Special Traveller Committee was that if the recommendations of the Special Traveller Committee was, because they're all similar linked, like the trespassing legislation, to repeal the trespassing legislation, to have our own traveller agency around accommodation authority. And again, they're very important, and we all do it collectively, but it's very important that we have the recommendations implemented by the government. So to say that the Joint Committee also and the expert review group highlighted the ongoing failures of local authorities. The traveller consultative committees are not working at a local level, nor are they working at a national level. The report states that the Europe ETOS definition of homelessness should be adapted by all state bodies and government departments to better identify homelessness. ETOS definition defines 4 main categories, include people living in insecure housing due to threats of eviction or domestic violence, people living in substandard housing, which would include trailers, caravans on illegal campsites, or housing that is unfit or extremely overcrowded. We've touched briefly on that. People living in unacceptable conditions are not currently covered in the homeless statistics. The Human Rights and Equality Commission also noted that 12% of homeless children are in emergency accommodation. 12% of homeless children are members of the traveller community, despite that travellers only make up 1% of the population. Most importantly is to hold the departments to account for implementing the recommendations that was made here today, that was made in the Special Traveller Review Group, and that was made by the Irish Traveller Movement, etc., and other organisations as well. Again, it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about implementing. One of our basic human rights is to have a safe place to call home. To many travellers, which should be highlighted here today, by the way, a trailer is a home.
What I will do is just talk a tiny bit more about the legislative definitions we have in the state and talk about that the ethos definition that we're recommending the state adopt. Now, the scope of the report and its aims would highlight the causes and impacts of both homelessness and hidden homelessness in the traveller community. As both Bridget and Senator Flynn have said, it used data that was collected in the spring-summer of 2018 with the assistance of Dr. Alistair Christie in the Applied Social Studies Department in UCC. Now, the aims of the report were obviously providing an overview of the current structures and systemic barriers, obviously, which have both responsibility for creating traveller accommodation provision within the state, but also in hampering provision of traveller-specific accommodation. Just to note that throughout, I'll be using the term accommodation instead of housing, in recognition of the fact, like Senator Flynn said, that housing doesn't equate to accommodation or the ideal accommodation for many travellers. For some, that might be group housing, that might be halting sites, that might be trailers or mobiles. Now, another core aim then was to explore the causes of the generalised traveller accommodation crisis. It analyses the way that this crisis, this general housing crisis, but particularly that experienced by the traveller community, has created worryingly high levels of homelessness, both nationally and particularly in the region. And it makes a number of recommendations of changes that need to be made to our policies around homelessness and accommodation to address this. And importantly, there is a real lack of data to support informed policy changes, and this is just another layer to add to that. So even though it's regional, it has national application. But generally, a huge issue with traveller accommodation and lack of traveller accommodation is insufficient traveller accommodation provisions. This has resulted in overcrowding. A lot of sites that were built, particularly ones in Cork City and County and Kerry, were initially built for a certain set number of families and then never expanded to reflect the way which the traveller community lives in family units. So this has resulted in overcrowding. Despite obviously a basis for transient sites being provided within the legislation, to date there are no transient sites provided in the region, despite there being a need for them and a request for them. And this all speaks to those general systemic failings, that implementation gap that we speak about in the report between the Housing Traveller Accommodation Act of 1998 and the lived reality of many travellers in Ireland today. This is then compounded by the fact that many travellers who are not able to source accommodation through the appropriate channels are then also unable to find accommodation within the private rented market owing to generalised discrimination. 85% of landlords who are surveyed said they wouldn't rent to a traveller, and there's case studies included in the report which speak to the implications of that upon the community. Now, when we talk about this idea of homeless and then the competing term hidden homeless, it's important to look at the state definition of homelessness. Now, Ireland is actually recognised internationally as a state which does have a definition of homelessness in its legislation. Many European states actually do not. Even though we do have that legislative definition, it is incredibly narrow. It fails to basically recognise many of the ways in which people are effectively homeless in the state today. So the relevant legislative provision is Section 2 of the Housing Act of 1988, and a person is considered homeless if there's no accommodation available, which in the opinion of the authority they can reasonably occupy or remain in occupation of. Then when we talk about hidden homelessness, we're talking about those excluded from those traditional definitions of homelessness, and by way of that thus excluded from the state homeless supports. And now Senator Flynn mentioned the ethos definition. It's considered to be the best practice definition of homelessness in that it includes most situations in which someone could become homeless. It was designed to respond to the different variances across the European member states. It was proposed by FIANSA, who are a European Housing and Homelessness Federation. So it's really rooted in lived experience and this idea of best practice. So it identifies 4 main categories of living situation. So obviously this goes much further than the Irish definition. So it includes rooflessness. So obviously that would be our traditional idea of homelessness, those relying on homeless shelters. So people sleeping rough on the street. Then we have houselessness, so people with a place to sleep, but maybe this is they're reliant upon shelter. We have those living in insecure housing, which unfortunately reflects the experience of many of those in the rented market at present. So those threatened with severe exclusion due to insecure tenancies, those without leases, those obviously at risk of eviction, and those in untenable housing environments such as those exposed to domestic violence. We then have those living in inadequate housing. So caravans on, it says they're illegal campsites. What we mean by those is those forced to basically reside on the side of the road, those forced to pull up because there is no provision in their area, those doubling up, those in overcrowded or just unstable, unfit housing. So a lot of travellers in Cork and Kerry experiencing hidden homelessness would fall under that heading. Now, when we talk about this shift in definition, this isn't just a shift in defining hidden homelessness. This would also shift housing supports. So instead of the current legislative definition would only really provide housing or homelessness supports to possibly the first 2 people there, those experiencing rooflessness and houselessness. If we expanded the legislative definition to include this broader definition, it would protect all of those on the list. So it would recognise the extent of homelessness created by the current housing crisis. in Ireland. Now, what this shift in definition does is it not only broadens possible scope of protection and policy, but it also means that the official figures that we have in the state are greatly skewed. Now, these figures, and indeed all traveller accommodation data, is skewed because many travellers do not want to identify themselves to the local authorities, to those doing traveller counts. So we do have to take most of these with a pinch of salt and actually accept that they're probably underestimations, that the problem is probably much, much more severe than we know. In terms of the report, the data set that we used, that was informed obviously by questionnaires sent around in spring summer 2018 and compiled by the Applied Social Studies Department of UCC, surveyed 397 traveller family units. So they were asked about their current accommodation among other factors. 22% of those, or 88 individuals, met the criteria under the current legislation of being homeless. However, when we applied the ethos definition, so when we went back and we saw those who were doubling up, pulled up in neighbours or in family members' yards, who were couch surfing, who were sleeping in cars, that actually expanded to 85.6%, which off the top of my head, I think was about 340 out of 397, which is shocking. So of those 397 traveller family units surveyed in the Southwest, 85.6% of those qualified as homeless under the ethos definition. And this really speaks to the depth of the issue and the depth of this insufficient accommodation policy for travellers in the region and nationally. And this is a massive cause of concern for the Regional Traveller Accommodation Working Group. So the key findings from this report, just to summarise, obviously, were to consider the causes of traveller homelessness, and it goes into these in depth. It speaks to the role of local authorities and the gaps in the state's traveller accommodation provision, what we call the implementation gap between the current legislative act, the Traveller Housing Accommodation Act of 1998, and the lived reality of travellers and their inability to secure culturally appropriate accommodation. It also speaks to issues with this, including where the local authorities have evicted travellers into homelessness, and it uses a number of case studies. I've talked about doubling up. Some of the examples were of young couples who were doubling up, staying in a trailer in their parents' driveway in their yards, who were evicted without being provided with an alternative source of accommodation. So we're then sleeping in cars. It speaks to this idea of the fact that hidden homelessness is a growing problem. As I said, we do not know the full extent of this. We only know those who have identified themselves. It speaks to those barriers to private rented accommodation that I mentioned. It outlines the limited scope of the current legislative definitions for overcrowding and homelessness. And it speaks to that limitation of current homelessness policy to respond adequately to the needs of travellers experiencing homelessness. So in particular, those put into emergency accommodation, that might be in B&Bs, often family units are separated. So in the case of a family, the husband, the father is sent to one accommodation site and the mother and the children are sent to another. And the implications that has upon a family unit going through a difficult time anyway, but then being separated. So it looks at the limitations of this, and particularly how this affects the unique community bonds and family bonds of the traveller community. So the core recommendations proposed by the Regional Traveller Accommodation Working Group of Cork and Kerry were to update our definition of homelessness, so to bring in that ethos light definition to cover obviously a broader scope, but also to recognise the lived experiences of those experiencing homelessness and how these fall outside that traditional sleeping rough idea, that very dated idea of homelessness, which fails to recognise the issue within the state. It also speaks to a need to update the current statutory definition of overcrowding. Again, this does not fit with modern standards. It doesn't include children under 10. So you could see theoretically a case where you might have a number of travellers residing in a 2-room chalet. I think there was a case in Killarney, and someone can correct me on that. But it was considered not to be overcrowded by the judge because all the children were under 10. Another recommendation then is on increasing our consideration of hidden homelessness and how that specifically impacts upon the traveller community, and how this is an obstacle that there's a lack of visibility here. There's a need for specific traveller support and responses to traveller homelessness, obviously that would differ from those needed for the general population. It responds to local authorities evicting travellers into homelessness. This shouldn't happen, but it does, and it makes recommendations on how that should be addressed. It also recognises the need for a right to housing to be inserted into the Constitution. Again, this would provide a better statutory, legislative, legal protection for those experiencing homelessness and hidden homelessness, and needs to happen. And finally, it recommends repeal of Section 24 of the Housing Act of 2002, which criminalises nomadism. And essentially, since that act came into place, it's seen a stop to travelling, which is a core facet for many travellers of their identity and historically the community.
We have the local Traveller Accommodation Consultative Committee, and I have sat on that committee probably for over 20 years now and been through. I think we're on our 5th plan at this stage now as well. I've also sat for a number of years on the Traveller Interagency Group. And I suppose the shocking thing about all of that is that all of that manpower that has gone into those different committees at different levels, and we still haven't seen any real progress with regards to traveller accommodation here in Cork City and in the southwestern region. And as Eileen mentioned earlier, it's across the country, you know. So I suppose I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the barriers that families are facing here on the ground. We're working very closely with a large number of traveller families that we would consider hidden homeless, you know. I suppose it's very tough when our organisation considers some of the families that are doubling up on sites. We actually now consider them to be the lucky ones because they have a hard stand, you know, despite all the other issues that's going on for them, that they haven't got their own toilet, their own shower, their own washing facilities, their own laundry facilities, you know. Despite all of that, we're now actually considering those families to be some of the lucky ones, because there we have a very large number of people across the board that don't have that luxury of a hard stand. We have a number of those that may have parents that may have owned their own home and may have space in the back of that home for a trailer or 2 trailers. In some cases, we work with families where there's 4 or 5 trailers in the back of their parents' home, still all using the one facilities. And you can imagine the stress that can have on families at different times. The real problem for us is looking at the families that are in camper vans or in the backs of vans, because if they pull a trailer outside their mother and father's home, people will know that it's a trailer and people might be living in it. But if they make a bed in the back of the van outside the home, not many people would know that, you know. So we're trying to keep it quiet and keep it low key, down top of all the other pressures of not having a home. That's the kind of reality. That's what we're working with families. And some of these families not even on any list anywhere, you know. Some families may not have children, so they're not even being considered by the local authority for housing. They can't meet the rent, they can't get enough rent allowance, even if they could acquire rented accommodation, which they can't in reality. But so I suppose it's some of that. That's the type of cases that we're dealing with on a daily basis, you know. I suppose the chronic overcrowding on sites is a major reality for us. And as previous speakers have mentioned, this didn't happen today or yesterday. This has been going on for quite some time. It is a clear result of the lack of traveller-specific accommodation being provided across the country, you know. And just as I'm speaking from Cork today, I suppose there's no harm in mentioning that the last time that there was any addition to traveller accommodation in Cork City was 32 years ago. So we've had 2 replacement sites where families were literally taken out of one site, put into a new site, and the site was then demolished. You know, the previous site was demolished. So we've had 2 replacement sites, but no additional traveller accommodation, despite the local authority tap the traveller accommodation plans, despite the lack of the yearly count being done for travellers, which was one of the recommendations from the 1995 task force report, you know. So again, dealing with all of those challenges and all of those issues in our organisation, and not just our organisation, the TVG, but also our sister organisations across the region. So I suppose, again, looking at the barriers and evictions around what's happening to travellers. I have, I suppose, been talking to families over the last couple of days when I knew you'd be preparing for the webinar, and you'd be talking to families again and just checking in with them. You know, I'm talking to a family that at the minute can't put her children to school. She's actually one of the lucky ones that we call lucky as well. She's in a 2-bed rented apartment that the landlord, she's never met the landlord, he doesn't know she's a traveller, so she will not have any visitors over in case the neighbours realise that she's a traveller. But she can't put her children to school because she has no place to put her baby that's quite ill and can't be around other children because of everything that's going on right now around COVID, you know. She's completely isolated away from her own family, and she's isolated from any interaction with the outside world now because her children doesn't even go to school. And I suppose it's just hearing the acceptance in the voices of the families over the last couple of weeks. And that's what was really frightening for me, to hear that they've now accepted that they will probably never get a home, you know, that they will never know what it's like to get a key and to turn that key in the door and have their own space, because they're so far, what they're considered is so far down the list, you know. What's really frightening for us is that We are battling this for quite some time, and we don't have any answers to tell these families anymore. We advocate for the families on a daily basis, but we don't have any answers anymore for families. Families on hidden homeless see only talk or mention from the local authority with regards to some of the very badly, poorly serviced, rat-infested sites that are here in the city. That's where, if there's any focus, it will be on those, improving those sites. Where does the travellers in hidden homeless go after that, you know? I suppose I have a case study that I'd like to just maybe talk to you about, and it just outlines some of the barriers that is keeping traveller families in homelessness. Okay, so this is a letter from the local authority to a family in 2011, and it tells the family that they are being accepted on the housing list, that they're on a list, basically. You know, it's back in 2011. Now, I suppose why I'm using this case study today is because I was part of a group of staff that left our building in and around this time in 2011, when we were called out to an eviction that was taking place where this family was involved in. This family and 3 other young families like them were set upon one morning by the Armed Response Unit, and a security firm that's employed or contracted or subcontracted by Cork City Council to move these families. These were 4 families that were living in a derelict piece of ground. So we were called out to support the family. And after we were there for quite some time and we asked to look at the warrant, we were told that we couldn't. And they snatched it up, they stuck it onto the side of the trailer, then they pulled it off, and then they left. You know, this was after about 3 hours where they had somebody's caravan hooked up to the back of their Jeep, ready to move it, you know. So this family we then went on to refer these families, because that's what we were told to do by the local authority. Refer the families to come in and fill out an application for housing. So we did, and the families were then referred to the homeless centre. I suppose the point being is that the family went to Drynan Street. They told the homeless centre that they were homeless. They had a caravan that was on the side of the road. The Drynan Street then contacted the local Gardaí to confirm this, and the local Gardaí came up to confirm it, impounded the trailer and took it away. So this family then ended up in the back of their parents' home with little or no interaction with the local authority after they had received this letter saying that they were on a list. So last year, or maybe the year before, they went back to the local authority to see where they were on the list and see what was happening, and they were told they have no records of them and that they have no application filled out with them. And so I suppose this letter for us is proof that the family did in fact fill in a housing application and were in fact told that they were on the list. So the next letter came just before Christmas, and it's dated 2021. But I suppose what it's telling them again is that they are eligible for a 3-bed house. They now have only 3 months on the housing list because they can't find their details from 10 years ago when they filled out their application form. And they couldn't be contacted according to the local authority over the last couple of years because they didn't have no fixed address, you know. So we have a family, their oldest boy is now 10, who lives in the back of his parents' home, who has worked very closely with our organisation through group work, men's work, women's work, children's homework clubs for the last 10 years, who have been in receipt of social welfare for the last 10 years, who have records to say that their children were in school for the last 10 years. And we have a local authority telling us that this family have only 3 months on the housing list because they can't find their records from 10 years ago, even though we have proof to say that they did in fact fill out a housing application form and they were accepted as a family and being put forward for housing. So I suppose the thing for us is this is a major barrier, and this is happening to families right across the board, because now at this stage, with them only having 3 months on the housing list, they won't even be considered for probably about 10 years. So that will mean they will have reared their family and their families will probably be gone on and married by the time that they'll qualify for a home from the local authority. And I suppose, again, this is just one of the examples that I'm using today with regards to the barriers and the difficulties and the causes of why so many travellers are in hidden homeless, because travellers are up against this type of stuff with the local authority. and they're just feeling that sense of hopelessness and acceptance, like I mentioned earlier, acceptance now that it's probably never going to happen, you know. So I suppose the need for local and national support is dire right now at the minute. We need people to start listening to us, and we need people to take action and help and support in any way that they can to get this off the ground, because I don't see any way out right now for these families other than the fact of accepting that this is what their life will be. And I suppose, again, looking at the root causes of the very high levels of mental health within the community, the very high levels of drug and alcohol within the community. And we believe that, again, accommodation is the root cause for all of these going forward.
Traveller homelessness is, unfortunately, a growing field of our knowledge and work. So we need to know as much about it as we can, whether that be at national level, at regional level, which we have here, and at local level, which we have here, so that we can construct an effective response to it. I would particularly like to welcome the report from its focus on definitional issues, because that means we know who is homeless and why and how, especially the focus on hidden homelessness. That's an important word, which many of the speakers have emphasised already. The use of the European definition of ethos, which has officially been accepted by the Irish state as a valid approach, and issues of overcrowding. In particular, this report looks at the causes of traveller homelessness and their consequences, with case studies, one of which Breda has just added a very illuminating and distressing one just a moment ago. This report is welcome because it addresses the issues of policy, legislation, resources, and an important R word, rights here, because those we don't always see them in all reports. And in particular, it highlighted some critical issues such as choice-based letting system, evictions, and legislation. I've been asked to speak for a moment about the report which was commissioned and published by Pavy Point, which is the report which you see here on the slide, the Traveller Community and Homelessness. I believe it was one of the first to address the issues of traveller homelessness using those two words together, one of the first to do so. The approach which it took is similar, using a similar method, framework to the Cork and Kerry report. The findings are similar, and in fact, I would consider that there's quite a degree of overlap between the two reports. And I'm going to say a little bit about this report and the conclusions and recommendations, because I know people are quite rightly very impatient that we see action and implementation. I'm just going to put up one table of statistics, but there's really only one figure that I'm going to ask you to look at, and it's on the second bottom line, where you see under travellers, you see the percentage figure 39%, because that is the proportion of travellers who are overcrowded. And if you can compare that to the national figure overall, which is 6%. And these are Central Statistics Office figures, so I think we can consider them reliable, though it would be interesting to see what update we get from the next census due later this year. But it is a very dramatic exposition, I think you will agree, of the very high level of hidden homelessness and overcrowding in the traveller community, which this report quite rightly emphasises. The picture emerging from the report which I wrote drew attention to site conditions as one of the main precipitating events causing traveller homelessness, especially evictions, often carried out by the very local authorities who had responsibility for housing travellers themselves. The report which I wrote looked at the trajectories in and out of sites and homelessness. It was not just a static report looking at figures now, but looking at what happens when travellers become homeless. And it looked at the revolving doors, people going out of sites, getting some accommodation somewhere else, returning back to sites, couch surfing, and living in cars as well. People going round in circles from one precarious situation to another. But above all, unable to get onward accommodation, as Breda's report just, I think, very vividly illustrated. be that local authority or private rented, the latter because of the high levels of discrimination there, but the local authority shortfall going back to 1987. Those of us working in homelessness at the field warned that if you reduce local authority housing, which had been running at up to 8,000 a year, it was reduced within 2 years to only 700 a year. And in 2015, the local authorities built 75 houses. That's less than 1% of what they had been building when we were a poorer country 20 years earlier. If you do that, if you turn off the tap of local authority accommodation, that is the crisis that we're going to get now. And it's regrettable that people warned of that at that time, but yet it still happened. And also the report, the Pavey Point report, drew attention to the poor experience which travellers had of homeless services, of list culling, taking people off the list without telling them, of social welfare rules, meaning only one caravan, one trailer per certain given square meters of area. The choice-based letting scheme, frontline services which could charitably be described as unsympathetic, the lack of onward accommodation, the policy of 2 strikes and out, where often arbitrary and unclear offers were made, but if you didn't accept them, you were off the housing list. Criminality tests. In other words, you were looking at a cumulative pattern of discrimination against the traveller community. And if that discrimination was not explicit, but it often was in private rented, under European law, if you operate administrative systems in such a way that some groups are more affected than others, that is nevertheless discrimination. One particular thing I would like to draw attention to here is that in the area of the traveller community and homelessness, there are 2 different worlds institutionally. Now you might say, what has the institutional architecture got to do with this? It sounds very arcane, very academic, way out there. It actually matters a lot, because if you look at this diagram, you'll see there is one system on the left-hand side for addressing homelessness, one part of the department, one homeless consultative forum, homeless policies around housing first, needs assessment, homeless action plans, waiting lists, allocations, regional consultative forum, and homeless action teams. On the right-hand side, you have the system that is supposed to help travellers with a different unit in the department, a different national traveller accommodation committee, annual traveller counts, traveller accommodation plans, local traveller accommodation committees, about which people have spoken already, different allocation systems and so on, and never the 2 shall meet. How can you address the problem of traveller homelessness when you've got one part of the state dealing with homelessness and the other part of the state dealing with the traveller community? So that is one of the core problems which I think we need to address. This institutional architecture divided between the 2 sees not only these issues as separate, but unrelated. And I think the report which we see this morning shows that these are far from separate and unrelated. They're totally connected. It means the problems of one are not seen or understood on the other. The system of this architecture is often untransparent. It's very difficult to find out how it works. It functions poorly. Many committees, whether they be homeless or traveller committees, have not met for many years. They function intermittently and inadequately. They are state-centric. The state gives itself a very strong role in controlling, in sharing, in putting large numbers of state bodies on these bodies, leaving not a lot of space for travellers or the non-governmental community. And above all, traveller participation in these committees is not given the kind of resourcing, if any, that it should, to ensure that it functions effectively. And these are some of the core problems, which is why the traveller accommodation committees and other instruments are so ineffective. There's no mystery to it. I'm going to come back to these points in a moment, but one of the points raised on page 34 of the report was that issue of housing associations. There are 520 housing associations in this state. Only one of them is exclusively responsible for travellers. This, although others are known to help them, like SONUS and DePaul, but it does mean that the housing association response to the traveller housing crisis is very, very limited. We know from the British experience that if you do invest in it properly, providing the technical assistance necessary to make it work, it will make a much more substantial difference. So what are the ways forward? And I've two columns here outlining what I think should be the way forward. First of all, we need independent reports on traveller homelessness of the type that we're looking at the moment, that do give a true and genuine reflection of what is happening, with annual conferences that look at this on a frequent basis and where officials may be held responsible. We've got to address the issue of the two different institutional worlds. We need to have travellers mentioned and addressed in the homeless action plans. They're not at the moment, they're often not even mentioned. We need to have homelessness mentioned in the traveller accommodation programs. So those two must come together in both these different schemes. We must have the use of proper ethnic identifiers. Many state agencies and many, indeed, even housing associations will not use ethnic identifiers, although they clearly would be a significant help in enabling us to measure more accurately the nature of traveller homelessness. And it needs to be a strand in the Housing First initiative where travellers are not yet currently included. The architecture about which I've spoken a moment ago must be reformed. There must be cross-representation with the two groups represented, the one on the other. There must be transparency, because even finding out these groups was very hard work. So that we must know who they are, where are their secretariats, and so on, so there can be proper involvement in them. There must be parity of esteem with both traveller groups and homeless groups, given the appropriate respect and recognition within them, and not being hopelessly outnumbered by state agencies. These structures must meet and must be made to work. They must be accountable. They must issue reports. They must have the right to issue and publish their own advice without permission from up above. The capacity of traveller groups must be built with Section 10 funding, that's the Housing Act already mentioned, which does provide resources for groups working with homeless people. But so far as I know, no traveller organisations have got Section 10 funding yet. There must be traveller homeless workers who specifically address the problem about which we've spoken this morning, and there must be housing rights workers, because that is a very specific and important part of this problematic. And finally, on proposals, my suggestion is that work be done with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission on the public sector duty, which obliges all public bodies, it's not optional, which obliges all public authorities to observe human rights and non-discrimination. And just finally, the concluding part of the proposal in the report came back to the issue of discrimination. Is there anything that could help us, either geographically or from our past history? Well, actually there is, and it's not more than 100 miles from where I'm sitting, though I grant you it's a bit further to Cork and Kerry, and that's in Belfast. Because when discrimination effectively prevented Catholics in Northern Ireland from getting housing, the British government set up the Cameron Report, which took away the powers from the local authorities and gave them to an independent agency, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, by 1972. Not only that, but it addressed the problem of supply by setting up the Northern Ireland Housing Trust, which comes back to the issue of housing associations I mentioned a moment ago. These were in 1969 and 1945. So it would appear that in this jurisdiction, we're lagging about 80 years behind Northern Ireland. Both of these measures worked. Nobody, not even the unionist councils who discriminated against Catholics, would argue that they should return to the old system again now. The Northern Ireland Housing Trust built 48,500 homes, something on the scale of the housing problem that then existed in Northern Ireland. Such proposals, though, have been stoutly resisted here on all kinds of grounds that local authorities wouldn't want their powers taken away and so on. But actually, that's not what matters. What matters is what would be the outcome for travellers, not local authority convenience. So one very concrete outcome was proposed, which was a bill which could be introduced in either the Dáil or Seanad for the transfer of existing powers around housing from local authorities to an independent agency like that set up under the Northern Ireland Act of 1972. with an analogue to the Northern Ireland Housing Trust to ensure traveller access to voluntary and social housing, but this is critical on a sufficient scale to respond to the problem. The Northern Ireland legislation in 1969 to 72 was actually very short. This was not rocket science. It was a very short, simple bill for the transfer of powers, with the suggestion that this could, without a lot of difficulty, be completed in the lifetime of the current Oireachtas, which, as I understand it, runs to 2025.
When we look at our housing crisis that's impacting on now the traveller accommodation crisis, the starting point, I think, has to be a right to housing. And when we look at that, the United Nations defines a right to housing that is adequate housing. It must be habitable in terms of providing the inhabitants with adequate space and protecting them from cold, damp, heat, rain, wind, or other threats to health. And importantly, it should be culturally adequate, which means it should enable the expression of cultural identity and diversity of housing. That's really important because the Irish state has signed up to implementing and fulfilling this right to adequate housing under the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. The issue is that while the Irish government has signed up to this, there is no real legal pressure points by which the state can be held accountable. And the report makes this point, which is the need to put the right to housing and the right to adequate housing in our constitution, which the report states, and I completely agree with that. And I think it's fundamental because until we take an approach to housing, to traveller accommodation that comes from the perspective of this obligation on the state to deliver habitable and culturally adequate housing, I really don't feel that our system and our state is going to tackle this crisis adequately. So I do feel that that recommendation of putting the right to the housing in our constitution is fundamental. The role of the state itself in creating homelessness. And I was really struck by that because that is something that I think needs to get a lot more focus and highlighting, because we have all this at a national level in the media. We have a lot of focus on homelessness, you know, the concern with it, politicians expressing, government, the state saying, you know, we're all signed up to ending homelessness. Yet here we have our state creating homelessness, and the examples are detailed in the report in terms of the continued criminalization of travellers and also the issues of evicting travellers in terms of overcrowding and halting sites. And I think that's something that really needs to be focused on, because the state itself cannot be evicting people in this country into homelessness. The other issue is what you've talked about, and it's something that my own research has focused on before, which is the issue of the private rental sector creating homelessness and the change in our social housing policy to become completely reliant on the private rental sector to deliver social housing. And this has had a compounding impact on the discrimination experienced by travellers. And this report finds this again. And if we think about it, what has happened is that if you are in need of social housing, if you're entitled to social housing, the main way you get social housing now is through the housing assistance payment in the private rental sector. But as you've pointed out, and as the report points out, there's a fundamental problem with this, because for travellers who experience this overwhelming discrimination in the private rental sector, they literally cannot access social housing under the current social housing policy because they are excluded from the private rental sector. Our national social housing policy that is overwhelmingly dependent on the housing assistance payment in the private rental sector to deliver social housing is overly discriminates against travellers because of the discrimination they experience in the private rental sector. So our social housing policy is compounding the accommodation crisis of travellers. And I think this in part explains why travellers are spending longer in emergency accommodation and why over time they make up a higher proportion of homeless families, is because there is literally no exit possibility for travellers from homeless accommodation because of the over-reliance on the housing assistance payment. And in this way, we see policy has compounded the traveller accommodation crisis. There is an issue as well, which is the overcrowding in halting sites, which brings back again the whole issue and reminded me, and I was conscious of it, and of course the group was set up in the context of the Carrick Mines tragedy. And the report that went to the Department of Housing just before December, which highlighted the serious risk of life in the halting site in Cork. And while I know Cork City Council is responding to that now, I think that there's a real question of, has the state, and I don't think it has, adequately responded to avoid another Carrick Mines tragedy? And I think that that again needs to be continuously named, that the state has not done enough in response to Carrick Mines to avoid another one. This crisis is not one of the making of travellers. This crisis is the one that is the making of a combination of historical, systemic, endemic discrimination towards travellers and the failures of housing policy currently. And therefore, I think the state has an additional and a particular responsibility to undo the crisis and ameliorate and end the crisis faced by the accommodation crisis faced by travellers, because it created it historically and it continues to create it today. And therefore, that's the obligation that I feel is on the state.
And one thing I'm so aware of, as I suppose a dad of 2 young children, is when we had the Carrick Mines affair back in 2015, and also subsequent to that, the OCO and the very detailed report he published in connection with the particular site in Cork, and what young children in our society, in our community, have had to grapple with and go through in terms of getting to their place of education and growing up with their family. And subsequent to that, I've obviously met with the OCO, I've met with the Human Rights Commissioner, been down to Cork, and we have monthly meetings with the local authority in question in Cork to get a resolution. And we have a number of families that we've worked with and found a resolution for. But in terms of a broad capital response to ensure that we have secure, sustainable accommodation, we're working very hard to deliver that. My tenure in 2020 is the first year that we've had the full budget spent, both capital and current, for traveller accommodation. We've repeated that again in 2021, and it's something that I have followed up with huge energy to ensure that pressing all local authorities right across the state to ensure that our full capital allocation was spent. I think that's so important, because we had a history previously of not committing or spending the full budget. And in 2022, I've started early again to get the word out to our local authorities of around 24.5 million, both capital and current, that we want to respond to this massive challenge that is in our society and our community, to ensure that we are getting money spent on the ground. This is generations of work, and I do appreciate, when people look back in the passage of time and feel that not much has changed, and it feels very frustrating in their community as they look at large at so much suffering, homelessness, as we see it's so acute among the travelling community, but also in terms of the progress that's been made. We need so much more data in terms of our traveller identifier going through. We really need to make significant progress in terms of our CSO and our data from the next census. I think that's going to be very important to try and pinpoint how policy should follow as we get the 32 recommendations implemented in the report. So obviously one of the key things was the traveller identifier in the first instance, to get the data to find out exactly what way our travelling community is housed, because there is a lot of the community that are in standard accommodation that resources aren't captured going in. I was on site, especially down in Cork on a particular site, and going through the community there, and it's very varied what the community want in terms of, some are happy and want standard accommodation, others want traveller specific accommodation. It's important that we have clear lines that can take their views on board and have developments that are suitable to their needs, and that's not there in the system at the moment. And as people says, in terms of the methodology isn't working in terms of the appointment, and we went through that in detail and are continuing to go through on a monthly basis with Cork in connection with their letting system. I think that's so important. But I know in the broader picture in terms of we're getting the increase in capital funding. I know the taps aren't going as they should be. They're not working as prescribed. I'm very clear on that. And we're examining, I've met with the opposition as well, parties to try and examine ways where we can bring about more accountability for the local authorities directly when they devise their 5-year programme. There needs to be teeth where they're held accountable if they're not meeting the terms of that programme, or that they're not providing enough units that they said they would, and to be held accountable in that regard. And that's going to be very important too. We're working on that as well.